See, Iron Man's similar to Batman, just has a lot of money and then a heart problem. So
he's rich, yeah.
So you and I could be Iron Man too.
Yeah.
You want to make a crack now about me in the suit? Huh?
you couldn't fit it. You couldn't.
I can't fly with the Iron Man suit. Where you can't jump and fly.
There was a big Iron Man suit. He fought the Hulk. There was a big one. This is hot. Drew, thank you for joining us. We reached out to you. Drew is, well, I'm going to let you tell us about yourself and introduce yourself because you probably know yourself way better than I do. But I do want you to know that Matt Russell, who usually co-hosts with me, is not here. And so I invited Joseph Clam, who's one of our executive pastors. The reason I did is because Joseph and I love good cigars and good whiskey. And I figured since you have had a podcast in the past on God and whiskey, I figured Joseph would be more of a professional. And since Matt doesn't drink alcohol, this actually works out a whole lot better by having Joseph here. Why don't you introduce everybody tell us about yourself and where you're from and who you are and all that good stuff.
Sure. Thanks for having me. I'm Drew McIntyre. I am the pastor of Grace United Methodist Church. I'm in downtown Greensboro, North Carolina, sort of in the middle of the state in the Triad area, if your folks are familiar with North Carolina. I'm primarily a pastor. That's my primary vocation, full-time, all that good stuff. I do a little bit of teaching on the side. I'm an adjunct instructor at Greensboro College, United Methodist institution here in Greensboro. I also do some teaching in the course of study at Duke Divinity School. And I enjoy some podcasting and writing on the side. I'm active in the Wesleyan Theological Society. I've done a couple things there, published a few things here and there on kind of pop culture and theology stuff. My wife, Brittany, is a physician, and we have two kids, a almost 4-year-old daughter and a almost 6-month-old little boy. And so we are occasionally getting sleep. And it's good to be with you guys.
Yeah, I think I stumbled across you on that wonderful and holy space called Twitter. And you like to mix it up a little bit on Twitter, which is good. I'm kind of I used to, but I'm finding Twitter has changed a lot lately. I don't know if could you move his picture up higher? It's like right behind that camera. Oh, there he is. So Twitter's interesting, but I learned from there that you have done a podcast and episodes called God and Whiskey.
Yeah.
And that was why I thought Joseph might like this, because we like whiskey, and I like whiskey. I like whiskey a lot, although I can't drink it quite as much as I used to.
I'm new to the whiskey world. Cigars have been a long time. I'm not going to say habit. It's been a practice of mine and
spiritual practice.
Yeah. Well, I don't know about spiritual practice. for me, I found, and I think this is why whiskey has kind of paired well with it, is that I don't slow down a lot, Drew, and I don't know about you. I mean, you've got little kids, so you're always on the run. But there are certain things in life that you can't do while you're always on the run. Mm-hmm. And for me, early on in ministry, cigars were a way for me. I had to sit still for an hour plus. In some days, that was the only time, or in some weeks, that once or twice, it was the only time I sat down long enough to allow my thoughts to catch up. And so it has become a practice. Now it's not a practice for everyone.
See, now I just want you to, can you stop by the house on the way home and we can have a cigar in the backyard?
We can contemplate. I'm
thinking about it right now. But so it's interesting. I mean, so like talk about the podcast God and Whiskey. You do it with another gentleman as well, right? Or do you do it by yourself?
A mix, but typically I've got at least one or two other guys with me, friends who are we were in the same D-Min program together at United Theological Seminary, Evan Roars Dodge and Will Leisure. Evan's an elder in New Jersey, Will's an elder in West Ohio. And so it kind of depends. We used to do it more frequently, and then Evan kept having kids and I had more kids and getting people with kids schedules, and whiskey at night doesn't always mix, depending on who's sick and who's throwing up and all that kind of stuff. So
so you have to press pause until you get a little Sabbath opening.
I've been a little lax on it lately. I did put up a new one since we were recording. I was due for one anyway, so I appreciate the nudge. But typically we review a whiskey or two, depending on what we have in front of us, and talk about a theological topic. So it's a mix of a whiskey review and talking theology.
Yeah, so to be clear, usually you're drinking whiskey. I have water and John has coffee, just to be clear.
I don't have whiskey with me. I mean, if y'all were down for that, I would be down for that, but I just have a
So when you record but it's like we record Tuesdays at 2:00 typically. So I'm thinking if I started drinking whiskey at 2:00 on Tuesday, I'd have to reschedule the timeline of when I would do do you do it at night? Do you record those like later?
Typically 3 guys with kids. The time that we have where there's nothing else going on is at night. So now keep in mind, you're allowed to drink whiskey sufficient to taste it and not be impacted by it in terms of your faculties. So
yes.
I'm not saying that we don't go overboard with it. We taste and review and discuss. We keep it classy on the God and Whiskey podcast.
Gotcha.
You got to keep it classy. So tell me about like your congregation. How many of your congregation members like follow the podcast? And when did you begin the podcast before you were at Grace?
Yes. Yeah, it predates my time at Grace, I'm pretty sure. If not, it wouldn't have been a problem either way. I have there's a few sort of bourbon and whiskey aficionados in my congregation who know about it, mostly because I've told them about it, because who else would be interested in it? It's a very, the Venn diagram of folks who are really into theology and really into whiskey is not a huge number of people. It does cut out some of the loud and obnoxious Calvinists, which is probably good because they don't drink. But otherwise, it is a kind of a select group that find both equally interesting.
Calvinists in North Carolina don't drink?
It depends, right? It depends on what brand of Theo Bro they are.
Gotcha.
But I find that a lot of the more conservative types, I don't have to bother with on the podcast because they're not listening to whiskey podcasts anyway. But no, my church is everyone. Well, I'll say this. When I first started at this church, they several different like families through kind of gatherings for folks to get to know me. And the very first one I showed up at, as soon as I walked in the door, someone handed me a beer. So I knew I was in the right church, and whiskey's no problem at my lovely downtown Methodist congregation.
Now, you also do a lot, Wesleyan theology, and you also, I think Jeff was sharing, you do a lot with pop culture stuff, and so you've kind of, I'm interested in how that works. Like you talked about, you've done some stuff on Game of Thrones or some of the, Superman or Batman or some of that. How did that come to you in a way that you found a connection to theology? I'm interested because it's interesting. You're pairing whiskey and God, and now you're pairing science fiction and God, or some of these pop culture narratives with God as well.
Sure. I mean, I think like, especially as preachers, we're always trying to connect everyday life to God, right? So I think those are natural connections for me. What are things I enjoy, things I like, things I want to talk about? How do those connect to my faith journey? I just finished a sermon series on Sunday at my church looking at Tolkien and questions of faith, topics of faith, and the Lord of the Rings trilogy. So it's sort of natural for me. I got into it. How did I get into it initially? So I've published a couple pieces in this series from Lexington and Fortress Press. It's called the Pop Culture and Theology series. I think it's called Pop Culture and Religion now, but they have a whole bunch of titles. They're usually multi-contributors, so they put out call for papers. I encourage you to check them out. Really interesting titles, really interesting subjects. But I think I saw a call for papers for proposals on Facebook or Twitter years ago, and it was for theology and Game of Thrones. And this is when Game of Thrones was the biggest thing on TV.
Yeah.
And I thought for a long time, and this is an example of the sort of move I make, I thought for a long time that like in Game of Thrones, you have these different religions, but really the closest group to the church in Game of Thrones, for me, was the Night's Watch, right? The Night's Watch. Are y'all Game of Thrones people? Am I talking?
So just to be fair, you've watched it, right?
Oh yeah, I can follow and track.
Not only I watched it, I read the books before the series came out.
Nice.
So
that's impressive.
and if you're that hardcore aficionado, you know that Martin never actually finished the series. The series finished, they tidied it up, and I guess he was involved. But anyway, so yeah, you're talking to like nerds about some of that stuff.
Oh, good. Well, we're on the same page. I mean, I hope in theory he's still writing Winds of Winter.
Yeah,
we'll see if it actually happens. But I haven't written any 800-page books, so I'm not going to argue with him. But so, for instance, in that, I was like, well, there's definitely a connection between the Night's Watch and the church. It's this community of outcasts that are bound together by vows. And oh, by the way, the world thinks their mission doesn't make any sense. So that's, for instance, the sort of moves I made in that paper. So I've done a few things like that, either in print or presented papers at conference. I did one on Batman and Sabbath that was also in print. I did one on Jesus and the canon, looking at Superman and Jesus. And then most recently at Wesleyan Theological Society, back in March when it met at Asbury, I gave a paper on the Marvel character Moon Knight, looking at sort of Methodist studies and Methodist identity through Moon Knight and the idea of dissociation and dissociative identity disorder. So yeah, I do have broad interest, but I enjoy taking the things I'm interested in and getting deep theologically with them in different ways.
So that's interesting to me, because in Game of Thrones, and people who, if we start going down this road, we're going to lose like a good portion of the audience, but stick with us because we'll get to your favorite superhero characters.
And we're not endorsing people under 18 watching Game of Thrones. I'm sure
no. The first season of HBO is just like Skinamax. It's like softcore kind of stuff going on there for a while.
I closed my eyes.
Yeah, they went really into that at the beginning, and then it wasn't so much later on. They got a couple of brothel scenes along the way, but you know what's horrible about those shows is I have found this to be the true, and I think every man who's married has as well. You start watching this season like Game of Thrones, and as soon as that scene comes, like the brothel scene, and it's only like not even 30 seconds of an hour plus episode.
Someone walks in.
And your wife comes in and goes, "What are you watching? Oh my God." I'm like, is that happening to you? It's like they don't walk in. They don't care anything about it. Game of Thrones, I don't care. But inevitably, and there'll be like 3 episodes with no skin at all. And then the 5th episode, again, another 15 minutes as she walks in. I'm like, I don't know what to do about this.
Yeah, well, I always found it really interesting, like these shows that before they have their masses watching, the way they try, at least there is a thought in which they hook people by they put in the gratuitous sex, and you're watching it and you realize that the later shows they're just as good, if not better. They don't need it,
and it's not really about that. It's just like
they need.
It's like,
they feel
it's
they
like
need
sex
to put it
in any movie. It's like they don't really need it. They just do it to kind of. But the point I'm making is that they have in Game of Thrones, they have the 7. So there's the church, right, of the 7 characters that kind of represent the divine. Then they have the old religion, the trees and the children. What do they call them? Anyway. That sort of harkens back to like the ancient religion that the people in the north still goes, more the earthy kind of religion and everything. And all that stuff sort of comes around. But I always thought it was interesting, like when you were talking about which one's most closest to the church, I was kind of thinking like the institutionalization of that church in King's Landing, like where the coronations happen and everything. And like it was very corrupt. And then there was this part of the season and stuff where the true adherents of the religion took over, like the fundamentalists kind of rose up right from the streets and took over, and they were like super holy and making people take walks of shame and tattooing, branding and all this kind of stuff. I was like, I see this in like society, right? This has been real, like in religious history. The thing plays out, but I love the idea. I never thought about the Night's Watch as kind of the closest depiction of the Christian church.
Yeah, it was a fun piece to write. I kind of dove into ecclesiology. I used the language from Brennan Manning of Ragamuffins, because it was this batch of ragamuffins, and they're given a new identity when they join the watch. It sort of didn't matter what you did before. If you were highborn or lowborn or a criminal or a nobody, you could sort of become something in the Night's Watch. But yeah, I do love the way Martin The other one in Martin's world is the religion of the Iron Islands, where they literally drown people and bring them back to life.
Oh, yeah,
right? It's like
yeah,
an extreme baptism. That one was fun to watch too.
What is dead shall never die. So when you wrote those pieces, did you ever have opportunities to present those and actually engage with folks around that? Or was it really pieces written, put out in publications or within groups? And who did you find were drawn to those?
Yeah, those were both like peer-refereed, peer-reviewed chapters. So we submitted them, got feedback, made edits, that kind of stuff. The downside, of course, and this is kind of the publishing world now, is those volumes that they're published in are part of a series that is largely aimed at library collections, so they're very expensive. The ebooks are sometimes more affordable. They go on sale occasionally. So you don't get the sort of engagement you might get otherwise. People drawn to those are primarily, I would say, pastors, clergy, and scholars of religion who also are into nerd culture, TV, movies, that kind of stuff. For the Batman volume that I did, for instance, one of the former heads of DC Comics wrote the foreword for it. So they get legit scholars and legit people connected to them. Now, the papers I've done for Wesleyan Theological Society have been presented in front of like at an academic conference in front of other I'm not one, but in front of Wesleyan scholars and others who were there. And I've gotten, feedback and had discussion on the one about Superman and Jesus and canon, and then the one about Moon Knight. Those were more discussions.
Yeah. So I think I would think that there would be a place within the community that would be really appealing. Folks who may never darken the door of a church, but they're going to stay tuned and have, Game of Thrones scheduled to record when it comes out. They're going to watch it and to engage in those type of conversations, because I think that there's an opportunity there for the gospel to be kind of mined and pulled out. And I just didn't know if you ever had opportunities to take that from an academic writing and to implement that more into a conversational piece with folks who may be Game of Thrones geeks and never thought about it from a gospel-centric message, and then be able to draw some of those connections.
Yeah, I do a lot more of that in my actual sermon series at church. I mean, what I just described to you, I just did a Tolkien series. I've done a number of things like that, Star Wars series, things like that. Different superhero themes. I'm going to do something with Grinch around Christmas, and those are certainly aimed at trying to catch the attention. I did a Johnny Cash series one time that I loved. Those are definitely aimed at sort of trying to catch the attention of maybe folks that are not involved in church, maybe not interested in Jesus or the church, but maybe interested in Johnny Cash or Tolkien or one of those folks. And so that's definitely a way it's come out in my ministry for sure. And I would say a lot of this stuff helps me connect with the young adults and kids in my congregation for sure.
Yeah, I would think, thing like, Theology on Tap type deal, which we've done here in Houston before. And you go and you're thinking about, okay, what will you talk about? These are the kinds of things that would be really popular. If you're talking about like Lord of the Rings, C.S. Lewis was kind of more directly on the nose with, the Christian spirituality, the direct tie-ins. Whereas, Tolkien, there's just so much more there, but there's so much religious and Christian influence in those things. I'm curious to hear about I've always thought like when the last go around of the Superman movies with I can't remember the guy's
Henry
name.
Cavill.
Yeah, Henry Cavill.
Christopher Reeves.
No, that's the older one. That's the older one.
That was my last. There was another one.
Yeah, that's when they hang them on wires and then blow the fans. That's old school. But there's a couple of those series that they prompted where, like in one particular one I remember, and it may not even have been that one. It may have been the one before that. I can't keep up with all of them. But like he's defeated. And, kryptonite, whatever, he has no power. He gets his power from the sun, and he sort of goes up into the sky. And as he's in the sun, he stretches out in the shape of a cross, And I'm like, you couldn't get any more direct kind of tie-in to this Savior, Christ-like figure who's willing
they've done that.
Yeah, who's willing to give himself up, for the greater good. He cares about people, right? He's like the ultimate good guy. I'm interested in what you did with Superman and Jesus, though.
Yeah, sure. I mean, that's definitely part of that paper was talking about how Superman's been a Christ allegory for generations now. That's a very, an only son and an orphan, someone who is both human and not human, someone who appears ordinary but has these extraordinary abilities. You can see all the connections. And what you just named, that sort of kind of crucifix-like position has been done in multiple projects. It was in Superman Returns, the Brandon Routh movie. They did the falling to earth in the shape of a cross. The marketing for Smallville, the TV show with Tom Welling that was on CW forever. The very first poster for that was clearly an allusion to crucifixion. So that's an old trope they've done appropriately so, I think, with that character. In the paper, I played on that. Okay, if there's this parallel between Jesus and Superman, maybe we could dig into that a little bit further and think about the question of canon and scripture. Because Superman, over time, depending on the author, has had sort of a broad range of abilities, costumes, appearances, love interests, rogues galleries, et cetera, et cetera. But there's also been this sort of core to the character, right? This at the core of this character is goodness and decency and simplicity in the best sense of the word. Now, people today think Superman is boring. They think Batman is cooler, or the X-Men are cooler. I think they're mistaken. That's a different conversation. But in the same way that canon plays into the character of Superman, of course, canon plays into the question of Jesus in the New Testament. So basically, I used the different Superman stories and changes in that character over the decades as an inroad to talk about the question of canon within Scripture, focusing on the question of how did we get the four Gospels that we have? Why is it that those four Gospels, why is it 4 and not 1? Why is it 4 and not 25? Why is it, some scholars have suggested, opening up the canon? What's one of the arguments for keeping the canon closed? And kind of where I landed with that is that the canon we have, how I would describe as the Holy Spirit inspiring the church, working through divinely inspired people, gave us 4 Gospels and not 1, as a way of giving us both a variety of portrayals of Jesus, but also keeping within what's called the rule of faith, or the earliest church teaching about Jesus. So canon then for Superman and Jesus gives us these ways of having both a diversity of expression while also maintaining a core kind of identity. If any of that makes sense, we can talk more about that. But
I think it's interesting. And now you've got this guy who's been working on the Marvel movies, I think James Gunn, right, who's now moving over and has already stated that he's storyboarding for this new Superman legacy type project that he's going to try to take the DC characters, kind of like we watched the other night the new Ant-Man movie, the Quantumania, which I don't want to get in any spoilers because the movie is still pretty new. But my daughter and I were sitting there talking about how absolutely astounded we are that those movies have been going on for how many years? 20 years?
Yeah, over 20, I think.
And how they've almost thread together like a long novel. Yeah. The Marvel is just shepherded and stewarded this thing in amazing ways that there's still, even in the newest movie, tie-ins to things that happened like years ago or movies upon movies ago.
Yeah, and if you are a Marvel watcher and you don't watch the credits, because you typically don't watch the credits, you're missing out on some of those brilliant connection pieces there are, because they're putting out these teasers and Easter eggs that are years in the making, that are coming down, but yet they're tied in. And so there's definitely been this intentional thread, which, I mean, as a storyteller, and I love hearing stories. I love hearing people's individual stories to help connect the dots of what God is doing in individual lives with how they have experienced the world. That's one of the things I enjoy doing. So when you watch movies that are intentionally connecting threads with different storylines and stuff, it makes you realize that, they're tipping their hat or giving a nod to the fact that every story is a part of something much bigger. Right. And that's a story that we find ourselves.
That's true.
It's the story of the church. My story, the Joseph Clam story, is a story that is a part of something so much bigger. It's a part of the story of Chapelwood. And the story of Chapelwood is something part of something so much bigger. Right. It's the story of the movement of the churches in Houston and so on. And so to recognize that individual stories matter, they're worth telling, they're worth listening to, and they're connected. Right. And Marvel does that better than any. You were talking about the Christological connection with Superman. Marvel also did that with Captain Marvel, right? And they did this female version where they had the same kind of crucifix type like image, like when she first ascends into outer space and she's starting to realize powers. Like there's just this scene where she's standing there like this, kind of all glowing, and you start to realize that. In a world where we're so quick to say that the church is losing relevance, that there are so many things in the world that keep pointing back to our deep-seated faith and beliefs, right? And are they're quick to tap into that. So
very quick. Are y'all into James K.A. Smith or read any of Andrew Root's stuff about secularism? Following Charles Taylor?
No.
Are y'all familiar? Y'all would like Andrew Root's stuff is very good. He's got a background in youth ministry. And then James K. Smith's book on Charles Taylor is a very good intro to Charles Taylor. If you don't want to read books that are this thick by a Canadian philosopher. But Charles Taylor wrote a book called A Secular Age that's just sort of his narration of what does it mean to be in this secular period that we're in. And so for Taylor, we're in what he calls the imminent frame, where in the last 500 years there's been a shift in Western culture and our civilization, in which it's where we went from it was almost impossible not to believe in God and the supernatural, and now it's becoming where it's almost impossible to believe in those things, and sort of broad cultural strands. But Taylor also points out, and this is narrated by James K. Smith and Andrew Root, and it's relevant to ministry in our world. It's just what you were describing, that it's not just as if we're in this strictly secular space, right? Everyone didn't become a Hitchens or Dawkins overnight. That they describe it as like we're in this cross-pressured situation where at the same time as church attendance is dwindling and there's all these signs of secularism, all these other forms of spirituality are increasing. And these bits like you're describing where there's still some draw to Jesus, to sacrifice, to spirituality that's still there. And so there's all these ways, I think, especially in our entertainment and pop culture, that I think James K. Smith says that the secular is porous. And we see all these little holes in the secular. And in those places, there are opportunities for us, I think, as pastors, as Christians, to point out to friends and neighbors and say, okay, look, that thing that you're kind of hinting at, that thing that you're longing for, even if you don't want a relationship with Jesus or the church, I actually think that there's something real behind that I want to tell you about. And part of how I approach the whole sort of pop culture question is there is a grand story behind all of these stories. And how can I connect these particular stories to the deepest and truest story that there is? And by showing people those little the world they think is so secular and so cut off from the spiritual, actually, they keep tipping their hat, like you said, they keep tipping their hat to something they may not even know is there, but there's an opportunity there to, I think, to reach people and talk to folks.
Well, and you find any of these movies that are nominated for Academy Awards and these themes, I mean, they're themes of forgiveness and brokenness and redemption and reconciliation. Yeah. I mean, they're all these key aspects of faith identity, right, that are a part of our story, and I think show up most of the time. They come out of sort of a Christian, Judeo-Christian based understanding. You look at those old stories. We've been going through a series on Genesis, and what we talk about is like these are not just stories; these are mirrors that we look into. This is us, right? The story of the Tower of Babel is a story of us on so many different levels. Not only of pride and overreach and rebellion, but also the desire to be one and same. And God says, "No, I need you scattered. I need you to be diverse. I need you to move out and not become some sort of a homogeneous kind of community." So I'm interested. So Superman, of course, he's easy. I love there's a little a video of some cartoon guy that made, it was at the end of the Avengers, and all these cartoons are there, and they're like, "Yeah, did you see what we did? We saved the world." And Superman's at the table, goes, "I'm all of you, like in one, right? I can fly, I have laser beams, I'm all powerful." It's like, and it's true. I mean, he's all of them in one. But Batman, now he's the he's the Dark Knight. I'm Batman. Flawed character, but he's also orphaned, a lot taken from him. There's this story of redemption, but he comes down that path. There's these similarities between Superman and Batman, but Batman seems to come at it from a much darker path or some way. Plus, he doesn't have any superpowers in and of himself. I mean, he's just a man.
Except for the billions of dollars he has.
Yes.
The billions and the technology.
That's what I love about
belt.
Batman, because with a few $1 billion, I could be Batman.
You could be Batman.
I mean,
you'd look great in the. Can you see Joseph in that suit? He'd be he'd be like Thor in the Marvel movie. Was it Fat Thor?
Seriously, you're gonna go? Yeah, look at him in that black. I'd have to get Alfred.
Hey, but he was
Alfred
still,
have to bring.
He was still Thor.
He was.
I would be too. I mean, he was still Thor. But anyway,
so good.
I'd love to hear your thoughts on Batman.
Yeah, sure. And that what I just said was basically a riff from Ben Affleck's Batman in the Justice League movie, where the Flash, played by Ezra Miller, asks him, what's your superpower? And he says, "I'm rich." So that was a line from one of Zack Snyder's movies.
Yeah.
Where I went in the chapter I wrote about Batman was primarily talking about Sabbath. Because there's this a really famous, you may or may not remember, it was a big deal in the 90s, sort of in the same period of time when the comics industry was booming and everyone was trying to find ways to get kids like me to buy more comics. Within about the same 6-month period, they killed Superman and they broke Batman's back and made Batman paralyzed. And that was adapted in a couple different movies. The character of Bane, that was in a couple different movies. That was from that comic book art called Nightfall back in the 90s. What I did in the piece I wrote was exploring the question of Sabbath in relation to Batman and that story arc, because basically the argument I make is he ends up defeated and broken. He, of course, comes back. It's comics. Again, the secular is porous, so everyone who dies in the comics comes back. So we long for a general resurrection, whether we know it or not. Yeah. But he does calisthenics, does rehab, and comes back eventually, but it was years in the comics. But basically it happens because he refuses to take a nap. This evil villain, Bane, who's very calculating, very both physically intimidating, but also calculating and brilliant on the level of Bruce Wayne himself. He begins by releasing all the prisoners from Arkham Asylum. So all of Batman's rogues gallery over the course of a dozen or so issues are coming after him one after another and basically running Batman down. He refuses to call for assistance. He refuses to take a break. He refuses to let Robin intervene. He just refuses every form of help, and he can't even sleep or slow down enough. And by the time Bane gets to him, it's not even a close fight. So I use Batman as a way of talking about how in our world, even within the church, even folks that want to follow Jesus and those of us that are clergy, even despite all the best of intentions, we are sucked up into this pace of a life where we don't allow ourselves to rest. And so the line I had in that resonated or that stuck with me was Batman becomes the villain in his own story, right? He becomes his own worst enemy. We do the same thing when we go and go and go and refuse to stop, refuse the rhythms of Sabbath. I'm a big Pete Scazzaro fan, so some of that was in the back of my head if you're familiar with his stuff on emotionally healthy spirituality. So basically, lack of sleep, lack of rest, lack of Sabbath does to Batman what in some tellings even the whole Justice League could not do to Batman. So that dark side of him that never quits kind of becomes his undoing in that particular story arc.
That's fascinating. Yeah, I'm taking some extra time off this summer because what did you call them? The Rogues Gallery in the last 8 years, from hurricanes to COVID to oil crashes to denominational upheaval. And so I'm like, I need to do this before Bane shows up or I'm in a heap of trouble. It's kind of my analogy for that. It's like time to take a break.
Yeah, I think that's really important to mention, and I appreciate that because, when we think about the servant leader, right, the suffering servant, the person who is pouring out, a lot of times folks get into ministry because they're called to love others, and when you think about loving others, you think, well, when would I stop loving others? You never. It's the call that's placed on my heart. Well, when one need after another arises, we will cite, that we are called to love God and love our neighbor. But what we forget in that passage is that it says we're called to love our neighbor as ourself. And truthfully, if I loved my neighbor like I love myself sometimes, I'd be a really crappy neighbor. Because you come in and say, well, I'm going to give, and then you don't find those Sabbath rhythms. And so I really appreciate Drew talking about that connection of Batman, because you're right. He actually was physically broken to where he couldn't respond. Right. And sometimes if you don't take that Sabbath rhythm, you may find yourself either with illness, physical, like exhaustion. I think about the 23rd Psalm, and you think about the shepherd that calls us beside still waters. And then the next verse is, he maketh me to lie down in green pastures. And I think about that maketh me side of things. Like sometimes there are times when I'm being led beside still waters, but I'm going so quickly, I'm not willing to slow down and enjoy or sit by the still waters in the green pastures. But sometimes our good shepherd knows, look, I created you and I created Sabbath for you, that you need to actually, I need to maketh you lie down.
Absolutely.
And so, and like with Batman, he's down in the caves, right? Or down in the pit with all the other folks, and this broken back, nursed back to health in the movie. Not as I don't know about the comic. I was never really a comic guy, but I love the Christopher Nolan trilogy and can watch those over and over and over again on repeat. Right? But there was a physicalness that he could not be Batman.
Yeah, and we could go theological with this and talk about. I forget. I think it was an older pastor, maybe a mentor of mine, one time, who said Methodists are all about preaching grace, but living as if it's all up to our works. Amen. Right? That functionally we become Pelagians very quickly. I think our world, and in some ways the church culture. I'm saying this as the younger, small church guy. My experience is that in terms of the leaders that I am told to look up to denominationally, at least the ones I've known personally, they're usually workaholics. And that's what our system rewards. But, functionally, that's Pelagianism. That's works righteousness. That's somewhere in the back of our head that we don't admit we have. As much as we believe in Jesus and believe in grace, we actually order our lives as if it is all up to us, even those of us who work and take a paycheck for Jesus professionally.
Yeah,
that's fascinating. Well, I'm interested in your take too. We're going into our annual conference next week here in the Texas conference, and when you think about the stuff that's been going on in our denomination and the United Methodist Church, I know our conference was hit really hard, and a lot of conferences in the South or South Central jurisdictions are. But, we were going into this conference this year, and what our conference leadership is trying to do is maybe not be so much into legislation and resolutions and debate and votes. We're trying to create a space where we can sit around tables and dialogue, and it'll be a completely different, mix of people, because 294 churches have disaffiliated already. Actually, more than that. We had another 20, I think, last week or 2 weeks ago. But it's going to be a different room, right? It's going to be a different spirit. And it seems like, I don't know how long you've been around doing this, but man, I've been 30 years now, and it seems like we've been fighting about this for almost that entire amount of time, although it's ramped up a lot more recently. And I've also, it's been around the presenting symptom as human sexuality and marriage and ordination, but man, I just can't get away from how much the culture is feeding into this now. American politics, American tribalism, this sort of loss of control or grieving of things that are changing that we feel like we have to reclaim. It seems like it's the racial issues, I think, are deeply a part of it. It seems like all of this is a mix, a combustible mix that we've gotten into. I certainly don't see it as a denominational split, but I do see it as a splintering off, where 10 to 15% of the churches in the U.S. will leave the denomination. But I think, I think we're still going to be around. I think we still have a lot to figure out on our own as United Methodists and what that means for us and who we need to be going into the future. But I thought I'd give you a chance before we kind of wind things down, just kind of what's been your experience and how have you viewed this? I mean, you've got an interesting way of looking at a lot of things. I'd be interested to hear your thoughts.
So we're gonna close on something nice and easy and lighthearted, is what you're saying.
Yes, exactly right. No, we can make sure we close on the lighthearted stuff, but
no, it's fine. It's fine. I mean, I think every Methodist at this point, so like the Bible, right? Always be prepared to give an account of denominational.
Yes, I think that's in Acts or somewhere. I don't know.
Right. Denominational squabbles. To make another sort of pop culture reference, a phrase I've used a lot with my congregation is, "This is not a story of heroes and villains. It's not a story of good guys and bad guys." So I'm remaining in the UMC, my congregation. I think different conferences have different languages, but we just voted to officially be a lighthouse congregation, meaning that we're staying and it's settled. And if folks are looking for a congregation that's staying, they can identify us easily. In my church, we've had LGBT folks as part of our staff and community ever since I've been there and before. So these questions were not as divisive for us as it has been in a lot of congregations, for which I'm very grateful. Now, that said, the church I came from, the church I served, my first appointment, is a church that's one of a couple dozen churches that are suing the conference to try to exit. And those are people that I love, and those are years of ministry that were a good experience for me. Those are not bad people. They're not evil people either. I have mixed feelings because there's a part of me that really thinks this is all necessary. I'm a bad institutionalist in that sense. I do think one of the thoughts I've had kind of theologically is, for a denomination that accepts the necessity of divorce, some of our leaders have a hard time accepting what's happening right now. We know, as pastors, we know this is people living in the world. Sometimes a relationship devolves very badly, and sometimes a breakup or a divorce is actually less harmful than continuing to be together and just hurt each other. And I feel like that's what we've been doing, especially the last decade and a half or so. It seems like we just continue to hurt one another. So as painful as this present, whatever you want to call it, is, I do think it's necessary. I wish that something like the protocol had happened so that there was more of a across the board policy on how to handle it, because it really seems like it's up to the generosity of your local bishops and trustees as to what an exit may or may not look like for you. I don't want to be in connection with folks that don't want to be here. I think people should have to pay something fair to exit with their property. That makes sense. Of course, because we're in such disagreement, we're not going to agree on what fair means. That's the problem. I do think it's sad. I don't think it's tragic, maybe is one way to put it. I think it's necessary. The church I serve was an old Methodist Protestant church. And there's something about me that gets that, because the Methodist Protestants left in part because they wanted more laity involved in the life of the church. They didn't like bishops. And the reason that we as the UMC have as much lay power as we have now at General Conference is because when the Methodist Protestants came back in 39, that was a condition of coming back in. So I think there is fruit and validity to different branches of our Methodist family tree. And I think God works despite of that. At a certain point, as Protestants, we accept a degree of separation from one another as Protestants. And unless so I've been not always the most charitable in my thoughts towards some folks who are very up in arms over the split, because unless you're trying to go back to Rome or the mothership in the Church of England, we're all Protestants and we all agree that split is valid. It's just a matter where you draw that line. So that makes me a bad that makes me a bad institutionalist. But I just have too many friends who are in the GMC, churches I appreciate that are leaving, to just write them off and say they're all bad folks.
No, I don't disagree with that. I've known a lot of good folks that are leaving. I've also, it's like anything when you go through a divorce. If having counseled a lot of people through that, they're ugly, they're contentious. It doesn't matter how amicable you say you want it to be, it never is truly amicable. I don't know that that's possible when you're breaking up a family. So my take is, my job was to try to do the best I could to defend kind of my thought process. And when I felt like we were being unfairly or mischaracterized or unfairly attacked, try to address that. But I mean, there's some legitimate concerns about the denomination, but
sure. I've told my folks there are things that GMC is doing that I think are right. Like a big one is itinerancy. I think our system of deploying leadership was outdated 70 years ago. And if the time ever comes where all preachers are 30-year-olds on horseback, we'll be ready for it.
That's true. Well, and that has changed a lot because the generation before me, a lot of the spouses didn't work. And when I say spouses, it was wives predominantly. Sure. And I was talking with an old DS recently, and when I first started in the ministry my first appointment was in the very early 90s, and we moved into our first parsonage. And I think it's just fascinating. It made me remember that. We moved in, and it was this old house with all this old furniture, and it had everything: dishes, silverware, furniture, sheets, towels. And I'm walking into I'm not using someone else's silverware and sheets and towels and all that. But then what happened was I realized from the generation that was before me and even before that, that the way they did it was they found out on the last day of the annual conference where they were going, if they were moving. And they usually stayed around 4 years. That was about as long as you stayed somewhere. And they found out where they were going, and they had to move 2 weeks later. And so their belongings were made up of pictures, personal knickknacks, and that was it. Everything else that you normally would think of as your stuff that you would move was in the parsonage. You didn't have silverware. You didn't have dishes. You didn't have pots and pans. You didn't have linens. You didn't have sheet. And that was an eye-opening experience to me. And now you think about how that would translate now to you as a young pastor. That's like a foreign concept to think that anyone would operate or live that way. I mean, they don't even do that in the military anymore. I mean, but yet I think that we've transitioned into a place to where we still have the elements of that, and trying to live in a modern society where young clergy are like, yeah, dude, I don't even want your house. Just give me enough money and I'll rent an apartment.
Oh yeah, for sure. We have a housing allowance now, and I'd much prefer that. I mean, my views are somewhat personal because part of my experience when I was very early in ministry and I was going through the ordination process and my wife was going through medical school, is I kept being told by DSs that my wife's what I consider a calling, her profession, was going to limit my ministry. In other words, you may not get the churches you think you want to be at because you have to be in particular places because of your wife's work. And to quote Michael Jordan from that great documentary, I took that personally. And the idea that I'm somehow less called than my wife because of what she does and what I do, I really find problematic. I do have an anecdote. I don't know if it's true or not, but I got it from a mentor of mine. I love this. This is from back in the day when pastors came to annual conference with their bags packed. And supposedly, at least in our world, the response when you got your appointment from the bishop was, "God is good, bishop. God is good, bishop." So the story is they're going down the line at conference. And Bishop says to Brother Thompson, "Brother Thompson, your appointment is First Methodist Charlotte. God is good, bishop. Brother Smith, your appointment is First Methodist High Point. God is good, bishop." And you get to the last Methodist on the line, and you're going. So in my world, sort of the outskirts, let's say, is Franklin. Brother Allison, you were going to First Methodist in Silva. Good God, bishop. That's a joke. So, God is good, bishop, or good God, bishop could be your response.
Yeah. No, I mean, I get it. I do think that, and I think it's true of most denominations, is that we don't change well, so we are constructed for a mid 20th century kind of worldview or a way of operating in the culture, and that's very much changed. And so I just think that, as I look and I see a lot of churches have disaffiliated. It's we were talking with Todd Bolsinger, someone that's in adaptive leadership. What do they call it? What's the term he used? It's an avoidance, and so it's like, well, if we disaffiliate and we become independent, then we'll be able to grow, or we'll be able to reach people, or whatever else. And it's not ever really dealing with the real issues. And if you look at a lot of the churches that have disaffiliated, when we look at the numbers, a lot of them are very, very small, rural areas, and a lot of them are going independent. They want to be independent. They're not willing to align with a denomination. And I'm thinking to myself, man, they had a connection to a denomination that was providing them a pastor, making sure they were staying connected and all this. And you don't have that anymore. I don't know. I mean, do they continue? Do they thrive? Do they not? I don't know that it's going to be any easier for them leaving than it would have been staying. We had problems with those types of churches when they were a part of the United Methodist Church. We'd scratch our head and go, what do we do with these churches where people don't live there anymore?
It's a huge, there's similar demographics and breakdown in our conference too. And, probably a lot of them were never Methodist to start with. I have stronger feelings towards churches and clergy that are leaving to go independent versus those that are joining a denomination. And largely, if you're going to call yourself a Methodist, to be a Methodist is to be in an accountable relationship, whether you're talking about a church or an individual. So as a church, you really can't be Methodist without being part of some accountable structure. That would not make any sense to the Wesleys or to Francis Asbury. So I don't have any patience for churches. And
I've said that too. It's like a Wesleyan Methodist church that leaves to go independent is anti-Wesleyan. Wesley would turn over in his grave thinking anything like that. But this goes back to the point I was making earlier, and we need to stop. But it's the cultural stuff. I mean, I don't want anybody telling me what to do. Don't tread on me. I want to be who I want to be and say what I want to say. I want to control my own destiny. I don't want to send anybody any money. I don't want to do. And so it's a cultural thing. That's why I think it was at the end of last year, there were about 2,000 churches that had disaffiliated, but only about 60% of those had affiliated with a denomination or planned to. And so you're talking about 40 to 50% of these churches that have no intention of aligning with anyone. They're just like, this is my chance to get out from under whatever. And that independent thing is a part of that cultural, tribal, political. There's something going on there that's, like you said, it's not theological at all to me. It's not Wesleyan for sure. But that's why I think the culture is a lot of part of it. I don't know that people I don't know that we have enough wherewithal, maturity, whatever you want to call it, to see that about ourselves. The church that
I think you're right.
Yeah, the church that I used to serve disaffiliated, and they're going to be independent.
Yeah.
And it's pretty good size congregation. It's great people, great church, but and they were right across the street from where John Wesley was in Georgia. So,
oh, wow.
Yeah. So I mean, it's fascinating. And maybe they won't be independent forever. I have no idea. But anyway, yeah. It's so ending on something positive. Do you have any hope at all for James Gunn rebooting this DC franchise? Because so far they just kind of seem like they're flailing. I mean, Marvel's just got it in the bag, but
yeah, I'm optimistic, in particular because I just saw Guardians 3. If you haven't seen Guardians 3, it's fantastic.
I have not watched it yet, so don't give it away, but I want to.
No spoilers. It's wonderful. It's excellent. I don't honestly think I think every superhero project Gunn has done, I have liked to some degree or another, DC or Marvel. So I've got a lot of hope. He seems to know his stuff. He's in his public posts about writing Superman Legacy. He's using an image from Grant Morrison's All-Star Superman, which is one of the best Superman stories ever written. So Gunn is a nerd. He knows the source material. He also knows filmmaking and writing. So if anyone can do it, he can. And I was someone that liked the Snyder stuff. I'm not, cultish like Twitter is sometimes with his stuff. But they had to do a reset, I'm glad it's Gunn. I think he'll do a great job. I'm excited. I've not seen the new Shazam, but what they're looking at, I'm hopeful for. It's time for there really should be a Superman movie that everyone can get behind because he's that culturally important and relevant, significant in comics. So I'm hoping that leads off a great new something for DC. I'm hopeful. Gunn is solid. He knows his stuff, and Gunn is great at taking. Here's that theological piece again, at taking the misfits, taking the characters that no one cares about, like the Guardians, frankly, and making you care about them, making you see them as characters. And so I think there could be a resurrection for DC under James Gunn.
Well, that's good news because it's
after 3 movies.
Yeah.
You got to give him some time.
But another part of that is look. Marvel had this long range vision.
Yeah.
Right, and they locked these characters in for a long period of time. If you got a Henry Cavill who's committed to 2 movies or 3 movies and then he's out, it's kind of hard to build anything lasting off of that. I mean, how many movies was the Robert Downey Jr. in? Like 100? I mean, yeah. And then even when he left, people were like, I wish he was still there. But he was in a ton of them. But
and you'll probably see all those characters back when Secret Wars comes around, because Secret Wars is a story that sort of will be able to bring in anyone and everyone. So we'll probably see those folks again too.
Yeah, because you get the shape.
Iron Man's similar to Batman, just has a lot of money and then a heart problem. So
he's rich, yeah.
So you and I could be Iron Man too.
Yeah.
You want to make a crack now about me in the suit? Huh?
you couldn't fit it. You could.
I can't fly with the Iron Man suit. I can't jump and fly.
There was a big Iron Man suit. He fought. There was a big one.
Hey, Iron Man, I think, is more plausible because it requires fewer pull-ups.
Yeah.
Yes,
Drew,
exactly.
It's been great visiting with you, man. You were invited to this podcast, and I'm really glad that I was included just to kind of be able to hear your story a little bit. I noticed that, and you did mention that you've kind of had taken a hiatus on the God and Whiskey podcast, and that you're going to kind of get those back when you can. You could do those by Zoom too, and you may have a couple of guests that would be more than happy to join you.
We're always willing to join it. We'll
suffering for the kingdom, whatever we got to do. But blessings on your ministry there in North Carolina. Thanks for sharing your story. I've really been inspired just thinking, and engaging in conversation where we're talking about how the gospel and how God reveals the gospel story through all these aspects of our life that it just takes a little bit of conversation to start pulling on that thread. And really, I think that's the invitation we have in today's world where who knows when folks are going to ever accept an invitation into a church. But how many times is someone going to turn you down and be like, oh, have you seen this new movie? You need to go check it out. And then the opportunity to follow up with a conversation. So what did you think of Superman? And how do we weave and how do we teach our people to be looking for those Christological nods, right? And I think it's just an exciting time in our world. So thanks.
Yeah, when you come on next time, we'll talk about Moon Knight, because I watched that, I liked it, but you talk about freaky deaky crazy stuff. That's like
Moon Knight's wild.
I need an in-depth a primer on that. So hey, thanks for being with us, Drew.
Thanks, guys. It was a lot of fun, and don't be surprised if you get the invitation to drink whiskey and bring the God and Whiskey podcast to YouTube, because I'm always up for some theological conversation, and whiskey is the best.
Sounds great.
Slow down long enough to think about it. Enjoy it.
All right, buddy.
There you go.
Take care. Thank you so much.
Thanks, guys.
I'm John Stevens.
I'm Joseph Clam.
And this is Pod Have Mercy. Now we're done.